Hello there everyone, my name is Waffles the Asian Yenber, and today I'm here to talk about how you're gonna make sparks fly and charge through your opponents with the rap god Enel. If you like balanced leaders that are a pain in the ass to finish off, then this is the deck for you. The aim of the deck is to build up your board in the early game while letting your opponent damage you, activating triggers that boost your board presence. Once your Dawn pile hits 7, the deck starts going off with big hitters that add life and are hard to beat down. The deck is only moderately difficult to start with, but it does have a high skill ceiling, especially related to how you decide to manipulate life with your boss drops. Unfortunately, being a yellow deck, it also has a high cost for your wallet. Thankfully, he does stay viable in OP-06, so the investment will last you a while in the competitive scene. Now, if you're still interested in playing Enel after hearing all that, then I'm here to give you my version of the deck along with some tips and tricks for how to handle each matchup. So if you don't know what Enel does, his leader skill basically allows you to add a card from the top of your deck to your life pile whenever you hit 0 once per opponent's turn. The downside is that you discard a card from your hand after. So as I mentioned, you're going to want to start by building up your board as well as your hand size and not stressing too much about getting hit for damage early on. Let's start with the early game cards. First up is 4 copies of Shura. He's pretty simple, he's just a Sky Island searcher with trigger, play this card. You're going to be going second most of the time, so this gives you an easy turn to play, and we run enough Sky Island characters to make sure that this is not going to miss. Then there's 4 copies of Holly and 4 copies of Ohm. Holly is a pretty basic card, it's just a 3-cost vanilla, but it really shines with Ohm, who has, on play, look at the top 5 cards of your deck, add a Holly to your hand, and then play a Holly from your hand. So this can help you grab Holly, but the more important part is that playing it from your hand is a separate part of the effect. That means if you already have Holly and you don't find one from the search, you still get to play it. Ohm gives us 2 5k characters for 4 Dawn. Ohm also has the bonus of getting an extra 1k power, making him 6k once you have 2 or less life. That's going to make him a good asset later on. Kiratsu is a 5-cost 6k character that has on play KO one of your opponent's characters with a cost equal to or less than their life. He's early game removal and another 6k body we can have on the board. Remember that we're trying to set up for our boss drops, so it's great to keep your opponent's board in check. We're running 4 copies of him. And then we've got 4 copies of Satori, and he does triple duty in the deck. He's a 5-cost 5k body with 2k counter and a trigger that lets you discard a card to immediately play him. He's a little bit expensive on Dawn, so he shouldn't be your first choice to just play him outright, but that's kind of okay because he more than makes up for it with that trigger and the counter power. Ideally, we get damaged and we play him off trigger, or we just use him as a nice counter. So let's talk about the big bodies. If cost is a factor, you can maybe vary the ratios here, but we're running 4 8C Katakuris, 4 Yamatos, 2 7C Lindens, and 2 Enels. Enel is definitely the weakest of the 4, but that's not to say he's bad. He's 7 cost for 7k power and rush, so he can be a nice way to finish off opponents that don't see him coming. Plus, he has the wonderful ability to, once per turn, if he would just be removed from the field, you can just trash a card from your life instead. Now, you're not always going to be doing this, and it does take a skilled player to know when it's a good idea to trash the life to keep him around. Ideally, we want to do this when you feel like you can add the life back next turn, and when we know that having Enel around is putting your opponent in a tough spot. Unfortunately, this effect doesn't work if your opponent has a Luffy character, which is just a reference to Enel's powers not working on Luffy. That's not really such a big deal, but it is important to remember against red and purple decks. Linlin is great because she makes your opponents choose whether to give you a life or to trash the top card of their life. Most of the time, they're going to prefer to give you a life, but keep in mind the board state and make sure that it's not easier for them to just give up a life when you play her. She's also a 7-cost 8k character, which is just good power. Katakuri is an 8-cost 8k character that lets you put up to 1 character that costs 8 or less into the owner's life area. That functions in 2 ways for us. First, we can use him to give ourselves life back, especially if we put one of our good trigger characters back. Or, you can use him as easy removal for big threats on your opponent's side. Yamato is my favorite of the 4 as he lets you KO one of your opponent's characters that has a cost equal to or less than the total life of both players. Unfortunately, in practice, that's usually not more than 4-cost characters, but his second effect is the good part. If you have 1 or less life, you get to add 1 card from the top of your deck to your life for free. Since we're playing Enel, we're often going to be hovering around that 1 life, so Yamato's effect helps us stay in the game while adding a 9k character to the board. Now life is pretty important for the deck, so let's talk about our trigger characters. We've already covered Satori and Shura, but as most yellow decks do, we're also running 4 copies of Brûlé, Sanji, and Capone. Brûlé has trigger play this character, Sanji has that too, but you also have to discard a card, and Capone allows you to stop a leader or character from attacking until your opponent's next turn. Brûlé and Sanji are also our deck's blockers, and Capone is another 2k counter. Those are pretty self-explanatory, but Capone is especially great versus Uda decks as he's going to stop their win condition. We'll get into that more in the matchup section, but we're also going to be running some events. We're running 4 copies of El Sur, which is essentially Yellow's Radical Beam. If your opponent has 2 or less life, it's a 1c event that gives you 4k power to a leader or character for the battle. This is great for the late game, so you do want to hold on to this. However, keep in mind that a skilled player is going to pretty easily read that you have it in your hand, as most Enel decks don't run other counter events. Thankfully, you can use that information to your advantage and bluff it in some situations by leaving a Dawn unused. We're also using 2 copies of 200 million volt Amaru, which is drastically underused in the OP-05 meta, but it does do 2 main things for you. 1, it gives your leader or character plus 3k power, which is only 1k more than just attaching the Dawn, so 2, it also lets you rest up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 4 or less if you have 1 or less life. So you know how red Straw Hat decks run Diablo Jambe to get the surprise win? That's what this is. You use it when you can rest one of your opponent's blockers and swing for game. And that's the build, so let's move on to some general tips and tricks. Tip number 1, go second. This deck plays much better on the even curve as you can play Shura on your first turn, Ohm and Holly or Sanji on your second, Giratsu plus a 6k leader swing on your third, and most of your boss drops on your fourth, and so on. Tip number 2, know when to attack in the early game. You don't always have to swing every turn, especially with someone like Ohm, who your opponent is gonna want to remove before he gets his power boost. If you hold off on attacking with some of your guys, you can go wide to start putting pressure on your opponent while still dropping your boss drops. Then you can carry that momentum forward to close out the game. Tip number 3, watch your hand size. While Enel's ability works even if you don't have a card in your hand, having nothing in your hand is a really bad spot to be in. Maintaining your hand resources is important with any deck, but with Enel, it's especially important. Trick. Since Enel drains hand resources, the deck is especially weak to decks that can go wide and hit him with a lot of small attacks. The Enel player will either need to drop a counter or let you take a life and then drop a card for Enel's ability. You can use the many small attacks to whittle his hand down and then swing for game. So let's talk about how you're going to handle certain matchups. As I mentioned earlier, Enel's biggest weakness is a lot of attacks at once, so you'll struggle a lot against decks that can go wide. However, Enel also needs a little time to build up to their high cost characters, so decks that can rush in with a ton of attacks and characters puts Enel in a pretty bad spot. On that note, Red Zoro is especially a bad matchup for you. Luckily, he's not so good in this metagame, so hopefully you won't run into many Zoro players. In this matchup, you want to let them take no more than 1 or 2 life per turn early and then immediately get rid of any characters they attacked with. Giratsu is especially helpful for this, but even characters like Shura can take out some of the weaker ones. Definitely prioritize character removal until you can take control of the board. They won't have an answer to your big guys, so you can worry about their life once you start dropping Yamatos and Linlins. Red-Green Law is a similar problem, but they tend to need a turn or 2 to get their board filled with characters, so it is a little bit of an easier matchup. You can just take the same strategy here. Red and Purple Law is actually a little bit harder. Since their form of removal is based on power and not cost, they can actually pretty reliably get rid of your threats. However, it does cost them a lot of resources to do so. Don't rely on your blockers in this matchup and make sure you're getting some sort of benefit from any characters you play, just in case the Law player removes them. Another red deck you may struggle with is Newgate, as they tend to rush out big threats and have enough counters to live through most hits. I would do your best to focus on building up your board with characters and not so much on leader swings until you have at least 1 big body on board. Funny enough, red and purple Luffy is actually a more favorable matchup for you. This can go either way, but Luffy tends to build more towards purple cards with a touch of red rushers. Even with the 7C Captain Kid boost, all of your big bodies can still attack life, and their low starting life total means you can survive a lot longer than they can, which in practice means they really don't have a good opportunity to go for the 10C Gear 5 Luffy. Even if they do, the second turn is just that, a second turn. Your leader skill can go off again and save you. On your end, you mainly have to be wary of the Rush Zoro and the Rush 5C Luffy. They're gonna want to catch you by surprise and take that last life with one of those. When it comes to Mono Purple Luffy, this can be a little bit troublesome. They have the advantage early on since they can rush to 10 Dawn, but once you catch up, the ball's in your court. You'll need to balance counters, hand size, and life. Blue-Black Sakazuki is a little bit similar. Once you can get the big bodies out, they have to use more than one card to remove them. If you can continually put one out every turn, then eventually they won't have any way to get rid of them. So this matchup is about whether or not they can knock you out before they run out of removal. As far as Green Uda goes, while she isn't out as of this video coming out, she really has the upper hand. An Uda player is going to be going wide while searching for 1 or 2 copies of I'm Invincible. The easiest way to beat an Enel player as Uda is to just keep poking you until they know you won't be able to stop 3 leader hits, so they'll be looking to put you into that position. The only 2 things you can do to prevent this is A, get Capone on a trigger and use it on Uda, or B, get those boss drops out there and just keep swinging at their characters. Uda players don't have any characters with Rush, so if you can keep knocking out their characters, they won't be able to hit you many times. Belo Betty is another one that can be difficult for Enel. She's essentially the polar opposite of your deck. She's all about getting 3 to 4 characters on the board, powering them up, and just swinging for life early game. You just need to be able to counter out, use Gidatsu to KO what you can, and hope you have some L-Thors in hand. If you can make it past the initial onslaught, they're going to lose, so just focus everything you've got on surviving. And that's it. You've got the advantage in pretty much every other matchup, so if you're curious about any that I didn't cover here, drop a question in the comments below and I'd be happy to answer. You can also check out my channel for more guides. I've already got one on Blue-Black Sakazuki, and Mono Purple Luffy is coming out very soon. On top of that, if you want to see the average deck list for Enel or any other leader in the game, you can check out my OP-05 Google spreadsheet in the description. Now with all that being said, I'm Waffles the Asian Yenbear, and I've got one question for you.
What the hell is rubber?